It was a very optimistic ending, Anton. Thank you very much. I also wonder, and I hope we can... it's good that childhood dreams are fulfilled. That's the American thing, no? That's your American background, that your dreams are fulfilled. That seems really American. It's beautiful. But also, I think it's interesting to think also in terms of this nomenclature in a way, because when you talk about a curator and an organizer as well, they're in a way they also imply work, but they imply a kind of different sort of work, or the different ownership of the work, different positioning of yourself towards it. So maybe that's also something that we could talk about, and maybe also in relation to the avant-garde, the communist historic Russian avant-garde, that this also their attempt, particularly the constructivist elements within it, to escape from the term art, and presumably also to escape from the role of the artist in traditional terms, and how that also marries maybe the sort of revisiting of the avant-garde today might be this similar attempt to escape, this flight from the condition of being the author and being the artist. It might be interesting. I hope we could revisit that later on. Our third speaker, so thanks a lot. Our third speaker is Ekatherina Degot, and I'm looking forward particularly because of all the work that she's been doing around the later period, if we like, of the avant-garde and its transition. Ekatherina is an art historian, art critic and curator based in Moscow. She is since 2008 senior editor of openspace.ru/art, an independent site for art news, art criticism and cultural analysis. And she's also currently professor at the Alexander Rodchenko Photography and New Media School in Moscow. In 2001 she curated the pavilion at the Venice Biennale, but specifically in the last years she's been very engaged with early Soviet art and the continuities of the avant-garde into socialist realism, curating shows such as Body Memory, Underwear of Soviet Times, which appeared in Moscow in 2000 and then toured through Russia. She said that was a way of telling the Soviet times through its underwear. In 2008, an exhibition Struggling for the Banner, and in 2009 with the fascinating catalogue, which is unfortunately only in Russian, but you can see the pictures, which is called Locomotive for the Future. And these exhibitions all looked at this period of the 1920s and 30s. So Katja, if you could come to the stage, thank you.
Sorry, just small technical pause. While it is being done, I wanted to say that I'm also very grateful for being here. Okay. Then let's wait a moment. While the technical part is being done, I wanted to say that I am very grateful, of course, me too, for being here and for listening to such extremely stimulating conversations, which I hope will continue this afternoon too. I was asked to show some examples of how avant-garde is being about the reception of avant-garde among contemporary Russian artists, which I will do. But I couldn't, of course, restrain myself from broader context and some more general thoughts. And I will be showing slides, I hope, but they won't be as perfect as you might want to. I don't master that much, the PowerPoint thing, all these things. But somehow, as it always the case, it corresponds to my point, because I will be speaking about bad images, poor images, and not so glossy images of Russian avant-garde and Soviet art. Okay. And the title of my talk is what is utopian about great utopia? It is often being asked if contemporary artists, and not necessarily Russian ones, follow the tradition of Russian avant-garde. However, what exactly have been meant by Russian avant-garde in this question is not completely clear and can gradually change with time. Kommer and Melamed, in their famous ironical comment on the 70s, on the subject, disclosed this pressure to be loyal to the letter of the avant-garde, as Boris Groys put it yesterday, which is nothing other than its fetishization of this geometrical forms as Russian anti-formalists would say. But recently, another type of pressure came into being, a pressure to be faithful to the spirit of Russian avant-garde, which is even more difficult. Again, to the spirit how it was understood in the West, communist, communal, participatory. The whole project of so-called relational aesthetic of the 90s was not just neo-utopian, but of course crypto-communist. With its collaboration, and of course the fact it emerged right after the end of Berlin Wall is very important. Crypto-communist with its collaborative projects, with its switch from representation to communication, collective non-alienated work, and even with some direct quotations like idea of abolishing individual authorship in such exhibitions as Utopia Station, for example. The more openly political activist version of this art of the 2000s became not even crypto but openly communist. The complete and final victory of capitalism, at the given moment, of course, made utopia possible again. I was always thinking of filing kind of post-colonial complaint about the term Great Utopia of the big exhibition, which, while it was prepared, the Soviet Union disappeared, which made it possible to call it Great Utopia. I was unhappy with this title because it meant the country I was raised in did not exist. Soviet Union was no utopia. It did exist well. The really existing socialism did exist, but after the end of Soviet Union, and actually in Soviet Union a ban was somehow imposed on this term. In Soviet Union, classical utopian writing was put into special department for secret materials, Spetskran, because Soviet Union was no utopia. It annoyed the fact Soviet Union existed, usurpating the notion of utopia and deactivating at the same time, as far as I understand, annoyed the Western left, especially when it turned out that life in Soviet Union was far from being ideal. But now communism is being restored as a distant horizon, as a communist hypothesis, as Badiou puts it, and utopia is reinstalled under the condition it will know its place, so to speak, won't transgress its utopian character, and would ultimately fail. And this process influenced the narrative of the Russian avant-garde. Normally, this narrative has been told in two chapters. First, the pre-revolutionary avant-garde, Boris was telling us about yesterday, was speaking about yesterday. Radically innovative abstraction with its language of reduction, language of refusal, with profound sense of asceticism, which attained its peak in the times of war communism in Vitebsk and Moscow. Kandinsky, Malevich, early Lisitsky, early Rodchenko's painting. And the second phase, which gradually comes after 1919, and especially mid-20s, is characterized by the return of the figurative in various media, and which is described in different ways, according to the researcher positions, as an evolution towards more dialectical art, which would not be doomed to just one form and one language, as an evolution towards factography, as Tretyakov would say, or with more as an version, Benjamin Buchloh, or towards anti-formalist art, or again as a kind of aesthetical thermidor, or realism, or narrative, or false step into socialist realism, even totalitarian art. In the corpus of this post-mid-20s artifact, only so-called new media, such as photography by Rodchenko, photomontage by Lisitsky and Klutzis, posters and film, are accepted by international art scene, by definitely not paintings and hardly installations except for utopian architecture by Tatlin. But this narrative, which is already much too simplified, as Boris Groys told us yesterday, now is being changed into 3 chapters. In between this first pre-revolutionary non-political abstraction and this dialectical decline or realism, which starts about mid-20s, the revolutionary political communist leftist art is being immersed, and it's, of course, a much more, realist image of what was going on in Russian and Soviet avant-garde. Art by Tatlin, Rodchenko, Lisitsky, and Constructivism, which stretches itself from 1919 to the late 20s and gets now most international attention, I would say. But even in this case, I must say, in the first narrative of 2 chapters and in the second narrative of 3 chapters, Russian artists would critically identify with the latter chapter, not with the first one, not with the second one, but with the third, not with early Malevich, not with communist Rodchenko, but rather with late Malevich, late Lisitsky, and late Tatlin. Not just because they take into account the evolution of the artists themselves, Malevich towards figurative and even neoconservative, Lisitsky towards photo paintings, his term, but because they see this last phase of Soviet art as the most radical abolishment of art autonomy, of bourgeois art institutions, and art itself. Now I'll show a short video. There is a return to this topic in a recent video by Olga Chernyshova, which I hope I'll show. Where a girl, which you will see now, an alter ego of the artist. Sorry, I didn't want it. I wanted to start from the beginning. Okay, maybe let's drop it. So in this video, a girl stays in the street and seems to make sketches or drawings from life. And we first see her face. And we see that she's drawing something, but we don't see what she's actually drawing. But then the camera shows us that she has a small machine to produce drawings, small machine where children could draw and immediately erase it. And what she's being drawn are triangle, circle, and square. And she's drawing them mechanically, looking with a very intelligent face and intelligent gaze around her to this post-Soviet reality, and she sells it. So as soon as she draws one image, someone comes to her and she's selling it. So this is another version of this Cormorant Melamed irony about images for sale. And this is not just a critique of the market condition of contemporary art as such, but a poignant comment on the inevitability of fixed and set geometrical forms, of the language of the former avant-garde fetishized and turned into formalism. While the only language of utopia for her, for the artist, remained mimesis, modest realism. You never can draw the reality in an accurate way, that's what she's saying. And what she does, among other things, Olga Chernyshova, the artist, are these... sorry. And okay. Yeah. And so what she does, among other things, among her videos and photos, are, thank you, realistic drawings, very, very 19th century oriented, not even avant-garde, not even pre-avant-garde, but pre-avant-garde. And Chernyshova many times expressed her dissatisfaction with contemporary art and her interest in historical realism, and realism as such. But in the West, many of these Soviet mimetic works I was mentioning, artists tend to identify with, were and still are censored aesthetically. It's not a big secret that under capitalism, only language of a capitalist alienation is aesthetically legitimate. A kind of language which, starting with Barrett Folie Bergère, tells, as Paul Wood puts it, the ultimate truth of the commodification of the world. and tells it by a mise-en-scène of this commodification and reification in flat and alienated forms in an exhibition value. It is these forms which are immediately perceived as the language of modernity, as an adequate illustration to Marx's analysis. It is the bitter language of lack, where something is missing, as Adorno puts it. For him, this something is missing had a liberating potential, but Soviet earlier theorists were criticizing modernism for its sadistic and masochistic character, especially because of that. At this point, I'm tempted to recall the polemics of Adorno with Ernst Bloch on the topic of utopia, but even more, the dialectical polemics of Ernst Bloch with himself. When in his Principle of Hope, he describes, as he puts it, two currents in Marxism, a cold one and a warm one. He could, of course, also have said a negative one and a positive one, or a critical one and a utopian one. Bloch doesn't oppose them to each other. He refuses to ascribe dogmatically specific aesthetic procedures to them. One can be critical remaining utopian, and iconoclasm must be understood, I quote, not as destruction of images, but as their penetration in order to revive their content, end of quote. Cold Marxism is dealing with an exposure and denunciation of ideologies. The Principle of Hope provides an exit to a boundless objectivation through the non-alienation of subject objects, and note this term. If communist art is utopian, then it is utopian on the aesthetical level. Blurring boundaries between subject and object, and offering an alternative to reification. Objects have to be literally re-educated to acquire subjectivity. And this was the main topic of constructivism around 1920 and 1921. And one of those objects by Rodchenko I'm showing you now. How can these objects or subjectified objects look like? They might be kinetic, as this object by Rodchenko. They might create space rather than being objectified. They might be communicative tools. This is everything which has been already said about these objects. But they are also objects where quality is unimportant. It's very difficult to accept for contemporary universal Western, because Western is everywhere, museum practice, where such objects are being cherished, exhibited. But of course, in the moment they were created by constructivism, the quality was unimportant. And I would propose to accept the radical character of these objects and non-alienated objects, and to go further and to expand this notion of subjectified object also to paintings. Let's start with this one, which is already, relatively easy to accept. This Malevich's worker, who takes the part here, not just of a new woman or a new person in general, who is awakened for the political action, for the speech, who sees this to be a passive object of either desire or exploitation. This is, of course, the content of this painting. But she stands here for the painting itself, which was nothing new for Malevich, who already equaled traditional paintings with disgusting nudes by Rubens or others. This new painting, or rather new image, as Malevich would put it, is a speaking one, a working one, a human one, subjectified one, which means a narrative one. So this is the painting which speaks here and which becomes a subject. This is a model of traditional, male painter, female model counterpart, which is taking another role, and not just the model itself, but the painting itself, which is taking another role. And it's at the same time, Malevich is exploring also it's one, as you know, one of the paintings which was considered his early one, but now it's discovered it's one of his late one, which was done approximately at the same time as The Worker, and where he's exploring the narrative on mimesis as biological reproduction. This work is called Sisters, and he is representing almost identical women, and this is about reproduction in biology and also in art, which he's exploring mimesis through this work. But I would show now this painting, which is already much more difficult to accept for Western art scene, a painting by a minor Soviet realist, which, as you see, has the same gesture as The Worker of Malevich, and could have influenced him. Actually, there are documents that he has seen it, and he somehow noticed it. So this painting, this new image, which is speaking. And this is Malevich again. This is one of his latest works, which is called Smychka, which is difficult to translate. It's a Soviet term which meant merging of city and village. And here he's blurring differences between the city and the village, workers and peasantry. Which for Malevich, of course, represented not just workers and peasantry, but futurist, technicism, and traditional art, respectively. He wrote about it many times. And to unite them seems indeed a much more challenging utopia than the Black Square. What this new subjective artwork was doing was to produce this smychka, this merging, or as Digevertev would put it, visual bonds. Now I'll show how contemporary artist is making a comment on that. Sorry. And this is the work of Pavel Pepperstein. From his series of drawings where he's referring to Russian avant-garde. It's a big narrative about the future of Russia. It's called City of Russia. And this City of Russia, which represents the universal world for him in the future of 2,000 or 3,000 years from now, there will be abstract forms which will take place of the human beings, and there will be wars between abstract forms and abstract notions. So it's a big narrative on this subject in him. At one point, these abstract forms acquire heads in his universe. This is in 3,494. Some of these figures actually acquired heads. And started to communicate as human beings. So it's a strange comment on the same things which was happening to Malevich at the same time. But how this new subjectivized artwork, new image can produce these visual bonds Malevich is speaking about? What has to happen? So this can be what they were calling mass painting, which means painting meant to be reproduced, which sometimes even didn't exist as an original, could be demolished and only existed in reproductions. Could be also instead that being exhibited as an original in a media situation, in the so-called Stengazeta, in some newspaper in an original and unique form, which could take place in the context of a factory, for example. This artwork could be produced collectively, which didn't mean actually painting together as many think, but rather discussing openly works of each other and sometimes even changing them after the discussion also with workers, with real workers on a factory, which was a typical practice of Cultural Revolution art. Actually, this practice would be completely normal for writing, and especially journalism. And this is an expansion of the media practice into traditional art, which is an interesting topic in itself. Another possibility of this subjectivization and humanization of the image was an accent on non-professional work. Indeed, for example, in Pavel Filonov's school, Masters of Analytical Art, many of the so-called artists came from very low classes of society and then disappeared into this society again. And we have, after the group didn't exist anymore, so we don't have any trace of many of these artists who left us their works but disappeared again into anonymity. Or actually, the last possibility, which would be the most difficult to accept, it could be this subjectivized work, could be any work which wouldn't fulfill the bourgeois idea of quality as perfection and authorship as individual stardom. This question was raised in a very radical way. Many of the Soviet realistic paintings disappoint us being bad on looking the same, and if it wouldn't be for Malevich's signature on this painting, this would be the same for this one too, I'm sure. But the quality was understood in Marx's sense as art en devenir, or as we would translate it now, art in progress, where we somehow foresee what this painting could have been if it would have this quality. And this work to understand this distance between what is in front of us and what could it have been is actually the work the audience, the viewer, the spectator has to produce. So it's a kind of poor image in the sense Hita Sterl is describing it in her essay, The Praise of Poor Images. It becomes a problem, of course, how to exhibit these works under contemporary spectacle condition. And now, as a small reference to what I'm doing, so this is one of my favorite pieces of an exhibition, Kudimkur Locomotive of the Future. It's an awful, awful painting, very bad, very strange, very late, done around 74, is a self-portrait of a completely unknown, obscure provincial artist who's looking at us, with quite Malevich's fervor and pathos. And why? So this painting, which never found its spectators. In her letters, she describes that how upset she is that she has lots of paintings and drawings at the end of her life, and nobody wants it. So there is no museum, of course, no collector. She even didn't imagine it, but no museum, no, house of culture which would hang it. So there is overproduction of these bad works, which at the same time are very close to her, represent her intimate life. And I would, in the most inappropriate moment, I would refer to the term non-objective art. So this is, of course, as far from non-objective art of Kandinsky or Malevich as it could be, but at the same time it is non-objective. We shouldn't forget that the term abstract was not the term Russian avant-garde actually used. They used the word non-objective, which didn't only mean that the object was not represented. It meant that the work itself was not an object. The painting was not an object anymore, not a commodity anymore. It was something else. It was something much closer to the human subjectivity and producing human subjectivity. And the reason the quality was unimportant in this kind of work was linked to the fact the very exhibiting gesture was defetishized in the first place. And this is the hardest thing to swallow for international art system now. So I found a possibility how to exhibit these kind of works. I reconstructed an imaginary didactic context. I took the text from these artists and wrote them as slogans, reconstructing, fighting this white cube contemporary conditions and going more into this didactic direction. Under contemporary conditions, when something is exhibited by a curator, it is being silently implied that he has some kind of aesthetical estimation of these artifacts, which was not the case in Soviet times, for example, where they sometimes exhibited works to blame them, to criticize them. There are many examples of such kind of exhibitions where works were exhibited on black walls, for example, to show the reactionary character, for example. And the curator did distance himself from the works he was exhibiting, which would be unthinkable now. What is going on here? What is this utopia we are talking about? We know that the ultimate and only utopia we know is the abolition of death, of course. And what's happening? What utopia are we dealing with here? It's a utopia of the abolition of death of art. In the case ars longa vita brevis, in this case ars longa vita brevis had to be reversed when artworks become subjectified, it becomes alive. This safe haven for art, safe because it's long dead, had to be blown up. Art had to become live, which doesn't necessarily mean performance and happening, as contemporary artists would think. This also means art has to become mortal. The very notion of the death of art was defetishized, which means that the fact art was dead, a very accommodating and useful situation, which gave artists endless rights, did not necessarily mean it may not die again. At this point, I would refer briefly to an extremely innovative theorist and urban planner, Mikhail Okhitovich, who at the end of 20s and around 30, before he was arrested and shot as a committed Trotskyist, which he was extremely polemical against home communes as static and fetishized objects, in contradiction with the ideal of freedom and self-evolvement. He proposed a radically individualized kind of habitation, an habitation for a free subject, also free to move anytime or to join anyone in the living quarters. These homes were produced out of recycled materials. We don't have even any images of them, and they were not meant to look, in a modern or even constructivist way. And network of these micro-environments was privileged instead of central planning. His main idea, however, his version of the theory of the city garden, implied not that much of an idyllic image of a small city drowning on flowers. The city garden of Okhitovich actually meant that the city will disappear. At some point, the city will somehow disappear and be overgrown by bad herbs, and so it won't exist anymore. And the best image to it would be Tarkovsky's Stalker, where this zone represents a rather realistic image of a late Soviet living environment. This program and this would be an answer to a typical question which is always being asked. Was constructivism an ultimate failure? And where were all the ideas and projects of constructivists gone? This is Kristina Lodar, the author of a famous book on Russian constructivism, is asking why were these projects never realized, never in the factories, in the industrial context, and does it represent the ultimate failure of constructivism? Actually, my answer to this would be that they were realized, but we don't recognize them as art. The whole Soviet Union was covered with kiosks as if they would be produced by Gustav Klutzis, but much worse in the form, much less autonomous in the aesthetic qualities, not having this outstanding aesthetic character we still admire in the works of Lisitsky, Klutzis, Tatlin, and the others. In this sense, art was, as in City Garden by Okhitovich, it was art's dissolution in the society. And this was the moment non-official art scene actually came into being, which was part of this program. Exactly as the amateur photography, for example, flourished in Soviet Union because it was very much, supported by the state. In the same way, unofficial art, as a kind of amateur art, also flourished. It turned against the state, but the very idea, the conditions to create this kind of creativity was created by communism itself, of course. And art as subjectivity production, Anton Vidokle just told us, the whole context of it, and the very idea of artist as someone who's not working, of course, emerged in the circles of unofficial artists. I heard this motivation for many of them, why to become artists in the first place, just not to go to the work. This subjectivity production is at the core of Moscow conceptualism. But this art turned into a different kind of utopia, a utopia of autonomous work of art, which was impossible for them. Under specific historical conditions, not just lack of alienation, but reification can become a utopian perspective too. A restoration of a possibility to objectify himself and to escape the total work of art. And the famous work by Andrei Monastyrsky, it's mid-70s. This object, which is called finger and which is meant to, you can experience it yourself, putting your hand there, and it means to point at yourself, which means that you can suddenly turn into a work of art. You can become an object. You can cease to be this subject, which might be subject all the time, which might become, really frustrating, and which was frustrating. This environment where everything was turned into a subjectified work of art. Under these conditions, Monastyrsky is trying to restore this object in art, and this the same thing Kabakov is doing his kitchen series, where he puts one unique object in the center of his board, and he's always asking, to whom belongs this object? And in most of the cases, he's not getting any answer. He's getting an answer we don't know, because the very notion of ownership is utopian. And I would say, I would put the theories of Boris Groys actually in the same context, because he was part of the scene, and this way of thinking where the whole autonomy of art is not an enemy to fight like it would be for leftist-oriented, Western-raised intellectuals, but is some utopian horizon which has to be, somehow explored. I recently, to finish this talk, I recently encountered same way of thinking in the work of a Moscow artist. It was an installation by Dmitry Gutov, where I found this utopia of autonomous object. What was this? This was an installation which was called Drawings by Rembrandt, and we were seeing some strange wire sculptures, which at the first glance did look like some, space version of Kandinsky's abstraction. Quite banal, trivial, uninteresting. But then, when you were finding one point, it's a spatial thing, it's not flat, you were moving through the room at that one point, looking at the image, at the sculpture, at that one point, it became obvious what it was. It was the representation of one drawing by Rembrandt, but it's this this one, of course. But it was unclear from the first glance. The gesture itself is a reversal of a famous Kandinsky gesture. Because we all know how the idea of abstract art was born. At one point, Kandinsky looked at his painting differently. It was staying, 19 degrees on the floor, and he suddenly looked at it and didn't see what was there. He didn't see the object. And then he learned himself how to miss the object. So he didn't invent abstraction, as it always said. He saw it. Suddenly. He suddenly saw that an image is abstract if you learn how to miss the object. So what Gutov is doing here is directly the opposite. How to see the object suddenly, how to disclose it somehow. As Picasso said, I'm not looking, I'm finding. So how to find this object and to stop the look all the time. Why actually this turn? What does it tell us? Monastyrsky's idea of rediscovering the object was under the conditions of this dominating, subjectivized, human, non-market conditions, where he was restoring this art autonomy. Maybe Gutov sees the current situation where relational aesthetics and political activism became kind of dogmatic mainstream from a certain point of view, maybe he finds time to restore another possibility. And I would quote here Slavoj Žižek, because even if he's not the only one who's expanding on the subject, who's claiming that we might have to revisit Marx's classic notion of commodity fetishism, where relations between people assume the form of relations between things, and that's what exactly Soviet avant-garde was fighting, this commodity fetishism, and reinstalling relations between persons on the place of relations between things. Now, and I quote Žižek, in immaterial labor, we cannot anymore talk about reification in the classic Lukácsian sense. Far from being invisible, social relationality is, in its very fluidity, is directly the object of marketing and exchange. In cultural capitalism, one no longer sells and buys objects which bring cultural or emotional experiences. One directly sells and buys such experiences. And we might say that in many of the cases, relational aesthetics actually collaborates to this kind of capitalism, as Claire Bishop also was writing in her essays. And I continue with Žižek. So one is tempted to turn Marx's formula on its head. Under contemporary capitalism, the objective market relations between things tend to assume the phantasmagorical form of pseudo-personalized relations between people, and Žižek also mentions the overproduction of psychological discourse, self-help things, and so on. However, he says, and I'll finish with that, before we succumb to bemoaning the alienating effect of the fact that relations between people are replaced by relations between things, they fetishize relations between persons, so we have, sorry, I'll mix things. So before we succumb to bemoaning, we have to understand that this somehow can allow them to require formal freedom and autonomy. So this autonomy of art may become a kind of utopian horizon for an artist craving for alienation, in the sense Soviet non-official artists were craving for alienation in this non-alienated work. The question is still open in which form this might happen. Thank you.